listener production.
Hello, happy Monday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. AI is creeping into every facet of life. We know that. But should it be deciding who gets to be born?
That would be problematic because then you might see people having their embryos potentially discarded or not chosen for implantation on the basis of what's really just a bias in the algorithmic decision-making.
In the second half of this episode, we talk about the ethics surrounding AI and fertility in Australia. But before that, Chris Spiri is here for the headlines. It is Monday, the 13th of January.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Fire crews are once again bracing for tough conditions as 4 fires continue to burn across Los Angeles. The death toll from the blazes has reached 16, an Australian man among them, while at least 12,000 properties have been destroyed. 2 of the biggest fires burning, the Palisades and Eden blazes, are less than 20% contained and more than 150,000 people remain under evacuation warnings. Channel 9's US correspondent Jonathan Kersley has told us authorities are bracing once again for destructive winds.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday here in the US, still going to be pretty nerve-wracking days for an already anxious community because they've got in place these red flag warnings, which essentially mean there's extreme or high fire danger.
Yeah, California's governor says these blazes could be the worst natural disaster in US history when it comes to the scale and cost of them. And he's also told NBC there'll be a full inquiry into why there have been critical water shortages in LA as crews have desperately tried to fight the fires.
What the hell happened? What happened to the water system? And by the way, was it just overwhelm? That you had so much that was used, we drew it down. Was it pipes? Was it electricity? It was a combination of pipes, electricities, and pumps. All of us want to know those answers, and I just don't want to wait.
And it's pretty typical, Chris, during disasters of this magnitude that people do look for someone to blame or at least, it's a natural disaster, but the questions inevitably pop up and people want to feel like they're doing something.
Yeah.
We saw it, the same thing during the Black Summer fires here. President-elect Donald Trump and other Republicans have been very quick to point the finger at the LA mayor for stripping $17 million from LA's fire department. And the LA fire chief too has been vocal about how water supply issues and budget cuts, quote, failed her firefighters. So there are a lot of questions to be answered after these blazes, which are still going. Like, it's not over. Over the weekend, they continued to burn. They got a bit more contained. But now with those Santa Ana winds kicking back in from tomorrow their time, there's that concern that these blazes will ramp back up.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong has confirmed she will attend Donald Trump's inauguration in Washington, D.C. America's 47th and previously 45th president will be sworn into office on January 20, which will be bright and early next Tuesday morning, our time. US Ambassador Kevin Rudd has also been invited and will also attend. In a statement, Wong said she was honoured to be given an invite and it shows the steadfast alliance between Australia and the US, Sash.
Yeah, it's an interesting statement, Chris, and probably being taken as a bit of a clear move to try to keep Australia off this list of countries being hit by tariffs when Trump re-enters the White House. Our countries currently do have a free trade agreement. So Anthony Albanese spoke on Friday about how he wants to make sure that that continues for us. Meantime, in more Aussie political news, Peter Dutton has soft-launched his campaign to become the country's next Prime Minister over the weekend. He spoke to the Liberal Party faithful at an event in Melbourne yesterday. The opposition leader debuted what's expected to be the coalition's slogan as we head to the polls: get Australia back on track.
Australians are worse off under Mr Albanese. Our country is less safe. Our society is less cohesive. And for so many Australians, aspiration has been replaced by anxiety. Optimism has turned to pessimism for too many Australian families.
Yeah, so what you'll notice there, Chris, is the opposition leader playing on that idea of, we've just got to go back to better times, playing on the nostalgia. Everything's gotten too negative and nasty. Like, we can get Australia back on track. It's interesting. It's the exact slogan that was used by the New Zealand Conservatives in their election in 2023. It's also believed to be a bit of a nod to Trump's Make America Great Again catchphrase, that whole idea of let's go back to the good times. It's been shit for a while. And we saw that was very successful for Trump, who kept saying during his campaign, do you feel better off now than you did 4 years ago? And I believe, and a lot of political watchers in Australia think that that's the way that Peter Dutton's going to go to. And we've got a taste of that.
And for our last headline, I would like Aussie tennis star Jelena Dokic to take it away.
Let's do it. Everyone up. Let's go. Here's the music. Let's go. Yeah. All right. I follow you. Go.
Yes, the Australian Open has officially kicked off in Melbourne, and that is audio of back-to-back defending champ Aryna Sabalenka dancing with Dokic after winning in straight sets against American Sloane Stephens. The Belarusian is on track for a three-peat at the AO, but isn't getting too ahead of herself.
Let's talk about that after I finish the tournament, hopefully with the three-peat, and then I can tell you which one was the toughest one.
Meantime, there was surprise heavy rainfall in Melbourne yesterday for day one. Unfortunately, that forced Sydney sider Alexander Vukic's opening round to be rescheduled. 4 other Aussies took to the court yesterday: Daria Seville, Lee Tu, Omar Jasika and Adam Walton, but none of them managed to book a spot in round 2 after losing their matches. Now today we've got a whole heap of Aussies in action, including Nick Kyrgios, Thanasi Kokkinakis and Ayla Tomljanovic, and reigning champ Jannik Sinner is also taking to the court, so it should be a really good day.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people are keeping their eye open for some of the celebs that are in attendance. We know yesterday we saw Rebel Wilson and her wife there. So, time will tell who else we will see rocking up to the AO. Also yesterday, sticking with sports, the Aussie women won their first Ashes test against England in the opening one-dayer in Sydney. Game 2 is in Melbourne tomorrow.
Woohoo, go the ladies. Thanks, Chris. Next up is our deep dive, and we are getting into whether AI should have a role in deciding who gets to be born in Australia. Around 1 in 6 Australian couples will struggle with fertility in their lifetime. That can mean different things to different people, but a lot of them will likely find themselves seeking help to have a baby through IVF. And in 2022, 1 in 18 babies were conceived and born via in vitro fertilisation. The industry is booming in Australia, and with more of us deciding to wait until later in life to have children, the number of us needing help to conceive is also growing. So, as demand grows, the technology that is used in IVF is inevitably being expanded and now includes the use of artificial intelligence. While it's not clear yet exactly how widespread the use of AI by fertility clinics is, we do know it's happening, and a new paper by researchers at Monash University is raising ethical concerns about it, saying AI could be deciding who gets to be born in Australia. Joining me now to talk about why we should be asking more questions is one of the paper's authors, Catherine Mills. She's a professor of bioethics at Monash University's Reproduction in Society Research Group. Professor, welcome to the briefing. We will get to the ethics of this question in just a moment, but first, could you tell us what the use of AI in fertility treatments actually looks like right now in this country?
It's quite difficult to tell how widespread the practice of using AI is because it's an addition to the standard process that clinics would go through to do embryo assessment before implanting embryos or choosing which embryos to implant. So it's really just kind of adding into that process. It's not a radically new process, but at the moment it's very hard to know exactly which clinics are actually using this or not because, there's never been a kind of national survey of who's using it or not.
Is it fair then to say that AI is playing a part in deciding who gets to be born in this country?
Yes, I think in certain places it's definitely being used, and that is right. I mean, it is kind of adding into that decision-making process, that's for sure.
So what does that decision-making process look like then? Like top line for people who, have no idea about fertility treatments and how it works, what role is it actually playing?
Usually in the IVF process, if you're going through IVF, you might have a number of embryos made from, the initial process of collecting egg and sperm, and then there's fertilisation. And you might have a number of embryos formed from that initial fertilisation. So then in the first few days of embryo development, you're really looking at how that embryo is developing to see which is going to be the one with the best chance of implanting. Now, normally when that's happening, the embryologist is making those decisions, watching, taking them out at different times across the first few days to really see how they're developing. And typically they would be doing something that's called the Gardner scale, and they'd be using that to rank embryos against certain features. So really the AI is coming in at that point. So the technology is that you use a time-lapse capsule or incubator. And that means that you don't have to take the embryos out, for one thing. And so that incubator is taking a number of photographs of the embryo as it's developing, and then it's using those. In addition to the time lapse, there's an AI algorithm that will be working with that, and the photographs from that embryo will be compared against, 20,000 images from other embryos, and the AI algorithm will then be making kind of assessments on the basis of those comparisons.
Okay. So, like you said, kind of a standard part of the IVF process, but at the end of the day, it's been taken out of the hands of a human and put into a machine technology that is being used in this space. Look, hypothetically, what could go wrong here, or what is the ethical concern with that, given that it is just part of the process of IVF?
So one thing to note is that at the moment, the embryologist still has a kind of key role to play. So at the moment, the AI tool is really used as an aid in helping the embryologist make their assessment. So the algorithm will produce an assessment, but that's kind of used alongside what the embryologist says as well. The question that arises, though, was what will happen in the future as that algorithm gets more and more accurate because the data set is bigger, it's better trained, it's deep learning, so it will kind of get better over time. If that becomes more accurate than an embryologist making the same assessment, then why would we keep the embryologist there? And how could an embryologist say, well, I don't agree with that assessment. I think this embryo is better than what it's saying. Because they don't know why the algorithm is giving the result that it's giving. They can't argue with it at all. So then if there's discrepancies, then it's really hard to know who should take priority and who should really be seen as the more accurate. And then if we get to a point where we think that the algorithm is more accurate than the embryologist, we're going to rely more and more on that algorithm. So then we're kind of giving up the decision-making power. That's really when AI is then making decisions about who will be coming into the world. That in itself is interesting because one of the classic problems with AI is around unconscious bias, or the ways that implicit bias is built in or can be built into the algorithm because you don't know what patterns it's actually picking out.
And something I read as well that the paper brought up was that how algorithms are trained to make their choice and that they could perform better for members of some groups than others based on something like ethnicity, for example. Could you explain what that means?
This is a very classic problem in AI models more generally beyond IVF as well. So we know that the ways in which AI models have worked have typically been to the benefit of some cohorts. They work better for some cohorts than they do for others. I mean, this depends in some senses at the early embryo stage whether we see differences between embryos or the ways in which embryos look at that very early stage. And there's some research that suggests there might be kind of differences even at that very, very early stage. So if the algorithm is then comparing those to a data set, and that data set is typically kind of, let's say, male embryos of European descent, and then there's variations from that, then it could be seen as kind of a less good embryo than it might actually be. And that would be problematic because then you might see people having their embryos potentially discarded or not chosen for implantation on the basis of what's really just a kind of a bias in the algorithmic decision making.
So in that case then, I suppose this question is coming up before things get to that point. So what sort of checks and balances should be brought in? Because AI isn't going anywhere and it does have benefits. It does have positive uses. So what sort of protections should the fertility space be looking at when it's using AI in its treatments?
That's the important question. And there is evidence that these algorithms do have benefits. They might kind of decrease the time that it takes for someone to get pregnant by choosing, helping to choose the best embryos. it speeds up that process. So it does have benefits. And it's because it has those benefits that we really need to think about what ethical guidelines we need to have in place. So we think there's a couple of things that need to be taken into account. The first one is that patients should, or we think, have a right to know that this is being used in their treatment. There are questions about how that might work, especially if it becomes more and more routine, and whether it increases the cost and so on. And that it's really about whether the patient's informed enough, whether they need to give consent and so on. The second group of things we need to talk about, I think, as a society is around the nature of the algorithm itself. So at the moment, the algorithm that's being used is what's called a black box model. So you don't know why it's giving the results that it's giving. It's a deep learning model. By its nature, it's black box. And that means that no one can explain to the patient why their embryo might not be selected or might not be good enough for implantation. And that raises some questions about whether we want to allow that kind of non-transparent black box model to be in that kind of position in relation to who gets brought into the world, or whether there needs to be guidelines around and a preference for more transparent models. That's something that the industry really and the developers of this technology really need to be thinking about. And then the third set of questions are really around the role of the embryologists themselves. As I said before, as the algorithm becomes more accurate, then how do we kind of ensure that there's still that kind of human factor in the decision-making process? How does it change the nature of the role of the embryologist from what it currently is to something that's much more technical, much more about kind of running the machine rather than really doing the job that they're trained for at the moment? So we think there's a number of areas that need to be taken up in terms of developing guidelines.
Have you taken these concerns that you've published in this paper to the leading bodies for IVF? I believe it's ANZARD in Australia and New Zealand. Like, what conversations are happening next?
We have, actually. So as part of the research that we actually did sort of stakeholder workshops with some leading people within the industry, and that helped us kind of set and prioritise some guidelines. And those guidelines we have then presented at the conference of the Fertility Society of Australia and New Zealand, which is the peak body in Australia. And we have then kind of published or written them up formally and presented them to the industry as well. So we're hoping that there will be some uptake and more discussion around that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Professor Catherine Mills, thank you for joining us. It's such an interesting conversation. And while maybe it's not exactly happening yet, we are looking at a future where AI could be deciding who is born in this country, and it's worth talking about before we get to that point. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
That was Professor Catherine Mills, a professor of bioethics at Monash University, speaking with me there. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, though, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. It is a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing. We'd love to keep doing it. And so is sharing our socials post. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.